Hello again, this is Mr. Liao, and this is the 2018 AP Micro FRQs. Number 1. In the early 20th century, limited transportation options and the lack of effective substitutes gave single cinema monopoly power in a small town. Assume that single cinema is a profit-maximizing firm and currently operates at a negative economic profit in the short run. Part A, draw a correctly labeled graph for single cinema and show each of the following: the profit maximizing price and quantity, and the area representing the negative economic profit shaded completely. So we have a monopoly graph, quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. Again, for a monopoly or any imperfectly competitive firm, demand is greater than marginal revenue. Marginal costs intersects ATC at the minimum of ATC. And you can see MC equals MR at QM. You go up to the demand curve and across for the price, and that's PM and QM. Now the negative economic loss, that's the area right there. It's the difference between ATC and the price. That's the average loss per unit, the loss per unit, and you basically multiply that by QM. That purple rectangle represents the negative economic profit. B, explain why single cinema continues to operate in the short run despite earning negative economic profit in the short run. Well, the only time they're going to continue to operate in the short run with a loss is that the shutdown rule doesn't apply, which means the price has to be greater than AVC or the total revenue has to be greater than total variable cost. So either way, they continue to operate because since price is greater than AVC, their losses are less than their total fixed costs. If price were less than AVC, then they are better off shutting down and limiting their losses to total fixed costs. C, would single cinema's total revenue increase, decrease, or stay the same if it decides to sell one fewer ticket than QM? Explain. So at QM, you saw that MR is still positive, which means total revenue would decrease if they sold one fewer ticket. Total revenue is still increasing at quantity QM. So that means if they sell one fewer ticket, their total revenue is less. You can also conclude that single cinema is operating in the elastic portion of the demand curve. Remember, for a monopolist is only going to sell in the elastic portion of the demand curve. That's where marginal revenue is positive. D, Part 1, single cinema hires workers in a perfectly competitive labor market with a downward sloping demand curve. Suppose the number of workers available in the market decreases. What will happen to the wage rate? Explain. So the wage rate is going to increase. What's happening is in the market supply of labor is going to go down. So for a perfectly competitive market for labor, if the market supply goes down, that's just like any of the supply and demand graph, supply goes down, price goes up. In this case, the price is the wage rate, and there's less supply of workers available. Quantity goes down. So what will happen to the wage rate? The wage rate goes up. 2, single cinema hires workers in a perfectly competitive labor market. What will happen to the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired? Explain. Marginal revenue product is MRP. So the MRP of the last worker hired will increase. Now, single cinema is going to hire workers until MRP equals MRC. And we know that MRC is equal to the wage rate. Now that wage rates are higher, that means MRC is higher, which means there's a smaller quantity where MRP does equal MRC. Therefore, the MRP for the last worker also has to be higher because single cinema is likely going to hire fewer workers since MRC is higher. Remember, MRP is decreasing, and they're going to keep hiring until MRP goes below MRC. So this graph comes from the AP answers. You can see with the market graph, supply goes down, so the wage rate goes up. For the firm, the supply goes up as well because remember, firms are wage takers for the price of labor, so the wage has gone up. You can see that MRP, where MRP equals MRC, is higher than it was before. So for the last worker hired, MRP is going to be higher. Number 2, modern day word processing software gives consumers the ability to create and save documents in different file formats that can be accessed by multiple computer operating systems. The graph below, or to the right, depicts a perfectly competitive market for word processing software. In the graph, MSB is the marginal social benefit, MPB is the marginal private benefit, MPC is the marginal private cost, and MSC is the marginal social cost. Part A, identify the type of market failure illustrated in the graph. Explain. So this is a positive externality because you can see MSB is greater than MPB. So you can also explain it that the equilibrium quantity, which is at point E, where MPC intersects MPB, is less than the socially optimal quantity, which is where MSB intersects MSC, which is point F. So in either explanation, you have a positive externality. There are spillover benefits. B, using the numbers on the graph, identify the market equilibrium price and quantity. So the market equilibrium price is where marginal private cost intersects marginal private benefit. That's at point E. So at point E, the equilibrium price is $6 and the equilibrium quantity is 16 units. C, using the labeling on the graph, identify the error representing the deadweight loss at the quantity identified in part B. So the socially optimal quantity, as I mentioned, is where MSC intersects MSB, and that's at point F. So DEF is the deadweight loss, is this area right there. That's basically the loss in efficiency because there's a socially optimal quantity that's higher than what is actually being produced. D, suppose the government is considering granting a subsidy to correct the market failure. What is the dollar value of the per unit subsidy that would achieve the socially optimal quantity? So the subsidy is going to be equal to the vertical distance between MPB and MSB. So you can see the distance between points D and E is $4. So that is the per unit subsidy that the government would need to grant. E, suppose the government does not grant the subsidy and instead imposes a price floor of $8. There's our price floor. It is a binding price floor because it is above the equilibrium price. How many units will consumers and producers exchange at the price floor? So the price floor becomes the supply curve until it reaches point F. So this blue line here basically becomes the supply curve. And now you're going to see where it intersects MPB, which is right there. So that's going to be at point B. At point B, 8 units will be exchanged at a price of $8. 2, does the price floor correct the market failure? Explain. Of course it doesn't, because the 8 units exchange is way below the socially optimal quantity of 24 units, where MSC equals MSB. So notice that a price floor is not going to fix a market failure. It's just going to reduce the quantity demanded because now fewer people are going to want to pay $8 to get it. Whereas before, they would be able to get it for $6. But even though the price at equilibrium at the socially optimal quantity is $8, putting in a price floor does not fix the market failure. Only a subsidy per unit does. Number 3, Nirali is a student at the University of Ainsley. She has 5 hours to study for 2 exams today. The tables below show Nirali's expected scores given the amount of time she studies for each exam. Part A, Nirali spends 3 hours studying microeconomics and 2 hours studying history. Calculate her gain from the second hour spent studying history. So what you're looking at is the difference from 40 to 60. An expected gain of 20 points. So for studying 1 hour, she would expect 40 points. 2 hours, she would expect 60. So that's a 20-point gain for a second hour studying history. B, calculate her opportunity cost of the second hour studying history. So if she studies history for a second hour, she would give up a 4th hour studying micro because remember she's studying 5 hours. If she's studying a second hour of history, if she doesn't study the second hour of history, she'd be studying 4 hours of micro. So basically you're looking at the difference of 96 to 90 points. So the opportunity cost to get that second hour of history studying is 6 points. C, assume she increases the time she allocates to studying history. What happens to the opportunity cost of studying history? Explain. So the opportunity cost of studying history increases because her expected microeconomics score is decreasing at an increasing rate for each additional hour she studies history. So you can see the difference here is 6, here it's 8, here it's 22. So you can see as she studies more history, she's costing herself more and more points on micro. D, assume that Nirali has a goal of maximizing the sum of her test scores. How many hours should she study for each exam? So basically, you can look at this chart. You're going to pick the combination that has the highest expected score between micro and macro, and that is 154 points right there. 2 hours of studying micro, 3 hours of studying history. Part E, Nirali learns that her tennis practice has been canceled, freeing up an additional hour of studying. Given your answer to Part D, will she allocate the additional hour to studying micro or to studying history to maximize the sum of her test scores? Explain using marginal analysis. So she should spend the additional hour studying micro because she's going to get 8 points from studying a third hour of micro, whereas she'll only get 5 points for studying for a fourth hour of history. So she can get 8 points of micro for 5 points of history. She's to spend that extra hour studying micro. That's it for 2018. If you have any questions, please leave a message through email or join during office hours.